Hi, my name is Hollis Woodard, and I'm from the Department of Entomology at the University of California, Riverside. And I'm going to be speaking today about the future of wild bee conservation as I see it. And I want to thank the co-organizers of NAPPC for giving me the opportunity to present and share some of my thoughts. When I first started graduate school in the mid 2000s, the world was beginning to become aware of the plight of wild pollinators. Since that time, there have been so many efforts to try to protect and save them, many of these efforts advanced by NAPPC. And yet, despite a lot of attention and a lot of efforts, the evidence suggests that we still very much have our work cut out for us. So I'm showing you a figure from a recent paper by Tara Cornelius and colleagues, came out just this year. They evaluated the extinction risk of a subset of North American bees, and they also looked at other taxa. And what they found is that more than a third of wild bee species are still at an elevated risk of extinction. And in fact, if they looked across all the different taxa they evaluated, bees ranked highest in terms of having the greatest proportion of species at an elevated risk of extinction. So, as I said, we still very much do have our work cut out for us. So, what I want to talk about today is how, in spite of all the absolutely terrible things happening in the world right now, I truly believe that the future is very bright for wild bee conservation and that we are right on the edge of doing some very exciting things here in this country, many of which are already happening. So I'm going to talk about four different areas that I've been personally involved in, but I want to make the point that far outside of these efforts, there are many other exciting things happening in the US and around the world to try to save wild bees. And so I'm going to talk about the things that I'm a little bit more qualified to speak about because I've been involved in them. But there are so many wonderful things happening that are reasons for optimism and hope. So the first thing I want to talk about is how researchers and conservationists are coordinating here in the US around wild bee conservation at a scale that has never happened before. So since 2020, I've been the lead of the US National Native Bee Monitoring Research Coordination Network. This is a large network of people who are working together to identify the major gaps and opportunities around wild bee monitoring. And I wrote "and beyond" because in truth, we've been working on monitoring, but we've also expanded out to work on many other topics as well. So today we have more than 800 partners who are members of this network, and they come from state and federal governments, nonprofits, academia, other sectors. These are all people with a vested interest in effective monitoring and conservation of wild bees. And this network was funded by the USDA's NIFA's Pollinator Health Program. The RCN is co-organized by myself and all of the wonderful people who are in the photos over to the left. There are too many to include all their names on this slide, but I do have their names listed on my final slide. I do want to say a special thank you, though, to Brianne Duclos. So Brianne was the project manager for the RCN, and we worked really side by side on everything I'm going to talk about today that comes out of the RCN. And so Brianne was just wonderful to work with, and I want to give them a special shout out in my talk. One of the main products of the RCN is an article that should be coming out later this year. We're submitting it as an invited perspective to proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And in this article, the views of more than 100 wild bee researchers and conservationists are synthesized. And what we wanted to do in this article is figure out what are the most important action items and areas where we need to be working to try to support more effective data collection for the goal of bee conservation here in the US. So I'm not going to read out the entire list. I'm just going to read out the parts in bold that are the three main areas. The first thing that we realized needs to happen is that we need to continue to expand our capacity for bee inventory monitoring and research. We also need to coordinate better our wild bee inventory and monitoring efforts, and the RCN is certainly evidence that that's already happening. And then the third area is that we need to prioritize our species and areas better for conservation. So we have more than 4,000 wild bee species here in the US. We're a very large country. We need to come up with frameworks for how we prioritize species and places for conservation action so that we can allocate our effort in the most sort of effective way possible to best save the species that are at most at risk of extinction. Okay, I want to talk next about some work to develop new methods for bee conservation. And first, I want to highlight something that was another primary product of the U.S. National Native Bee Monitoring Research Coordination Network. And this is a special issue series that came out this year in the Journal of Melitology. That's a set of standardized protocols for wild bee data collection. This special issue series was co-organized by myself and Hannah Levinson at NC State University. Hannah's another person I want to give a shout out to. She was fantastic to work with on this project. If you'd like to visit the website that links to all these articles, the QR code on the bottom right can get you there. So this series includes articles on how to collect community level bee data, focal species occupancy data, uh, bee flower interactions, and so on. And we also include the wild bee data standard, which is the first data standard for wild bee data. And in this article, we really make a call for having more standardized methods. We include vocabularies for collecting wild bee data and so on. So this is all available now online at the Journal of Melitology's website, and again, linked through the QR code on the bottom right of the slide. Another project I've been involved in is the State of the Bees. So this project is being led by Saf Killingsworth at the Xerces Society and co-led by Oscar Martinez Lopez, a postdoctoral researcher in my lab. This effort too is a collaboration between ourselves and many different scientists, and the effort has been funded by the many different funders and partners that I'm showing on the right of this slide. And what we're doing in the State of the Bees project is we're working to improve how we evaluate extinction risk for bees. We're creating more standardized methods for doing these evaluations of extinction risk. And then we'll be using those methods to assess the status of all US bee species. And I want to say that these methods, we're working within established frameworks, so the NatureServe and IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We're working within their frameworks for evaluating extinction risk, but we're adding some additional standards that are important for evaluating extinction risk for wild bees. And the goal of this project, or the spirit of this project, is that if we develop more standardized high throughput workflows for evaluating extinction risk, then we can evaluate more readily. Anytime new data come in, we can easily reevaluate the status of a species. We'll be synthesizing the information on extinction risk and directing it to other projects. So you're going to hear me talk about a couple more projects where you can see how being able to prioritize our most imperiled bee species, this information can feed directly into some of these other projects. And then another thing we're doing is making species trait, habitat threat, and rank information more readily available to the people who need it. So we're thinking a lot about the land and species managers who are working to conserve wild bees. How do we get some of the information about what bees need and their extinction risk, et cetera, into the hands of the people that really use that information to make decisions? Okay, next I want to talk about how an effective national wild bee monitoring program is on the horizon. So many of us probably listening to this talk know how exciting it was when the highest levels of our federal government formally recognized how important pollinator protection is. And one of the things that's been mentioned for quite a while now is the need for a wild bee monitoring program. And beginning quite a few years ago, I became interested in the challenge of how we might build such a program that really serves people in the US and helps truly protect and conserve wild bees. And so this is something I wrote about in 2020 in the article I've included a snapshot of on the right. If we want to build a national wild bee program for the entire United States, it has to be efficient and it has to be effective. And when I say efficient, what I mean is it has to be coordinated in such a way that it serves everyone that wants to monitor and conserve bees. It helps organize their efforts and make their efforts easier. And when I say efficient, I think my meaning there can be well encapsulated in a quote from a paper on monitoring for the purpose of conservation by Nichols and Williams from 2006. The monitoring data are not gathered with a vague hope that somehow they will prove useful for conservation. Instead, monitoring focuses on precisely the information needed to make conservation decisions. So we want to build a program that will generate insights into how to manage and conserve our most at-risk wild bee populations. This project is a collaboration between myself and scientists from USGS. It's led by Clint Otto, and we are working with Bethany Straw and Brian Reichert from the North American Bat Monitoring Program to build something that is based off of the architecture of NABAT, but built for bees. So I just want to show this slide that shows this hierarchical structure of NABAT. This is something I've been listening to people for a long time here in the US tell me why they're monitoring bees and working to conserve them, how they want to do it. I want to build a system that helps support the needs of the people around the US who are trying to collect and use those data. So NABAT is built in such a way that it is designed around user needs, but then it helps coordinate people's monitoring and data collection activities. And so it's got this top-down and bottom-up structure. And I want to have something similar to help support wild bee conservation here in the US. If you want to learn more about the structure of NABAT and how it functions, I've included a citation at the bottom of this slide. So the goal of the U.S. Wild Bee Monitoring Program, or USB for short, is to improve how we monitor wild bees for conservation. Right now, we're in the process of designing species-specific monitoring plans for a set of our most at-risk bee species. As I said, we're going to be building this architecture or national infrastructure for wild bee monitoring data and information. And the overarching goal is to generate management and conservation insights we need to actually protect wild bees. So we have a lot of amazing inventory and atlas and other data collection efforts going on here in the US. We want to build a program that helps or complements those efforts and gets us more of the specific population management and conservation insights we need to protect our imperiled bee species here in the US. Okay, I want to close by talking about some new frameworks for bee conservation that are emerging that I'm particularly excited about and involved in. The first is the lost species framework. So a lost species is defined as a species that has not been detected in 10 or more years. This is a concept that was really formally canalized by Barney Long from the conservation nonprofit Rewild and John Paul Rodriguez, who was the head of the Species Survival Commission at the IUCN, in a paper from 2022. So a species can be lost if it's extinct. So obviously, if something has gone extinct, then we won't detect it. But at the same time, something can also be classified as lost if we simply haven't searched enough for it. And so that idea or that concept that these two things are related but separate is encapsulated in the figure on the right. This figure was drawn by Matt Forrester, a collaborator of mine on some of these projects. The ivory-billed woodpecker over on the left is a classic example of a species that is lost. It hasn't been seen officially since the 1950s, although there are some interesting video and photographic potential pieces of evidence for this bird. So it turns out that we have a lot of lost bee species here in the United States as well. But we know because of the work of Paige Cheshire and colleagues and other bee researchers across the US that there are many places that we simply haven't collected bee data. And so many of our bee species that are classified as lost, we might be able to find them by searching more. So Matt and I are so excited about this idea that we've actually started an entire new peer-reviewed journal about lost species. This journal is a partnership with the conservation nonprofit Rewild and the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN. If you want to learn more about the journal, I've included a QR code on the bottom right. We are accepting new articles for our first few issues of the journal. And so if you know about lost pollinator species, and are interested in potentially submitting something to our journal, don't hesitate to reach out and let me know, and I can help give you more information about publishing. I want to tell you a very short story about a lost bee species that I think illustrates one reason why I'm so excited about this as a concept. So I've been working on identifying lost bees in North America and then also species that are lost specifically to California, the state where I work. So we've been curating a list of lost bee species. And I've had the pleasure of getting to know Crystal Hickman, a conservation photographer who works on bees in the last few years. And I showed this list to Crystal, and she said, "Oh, I've actually seen some of these species." And so these are species that, again, we don't have any scientific records of these species from 10 or more years, but Crystal has photographed them. So she spends a lot of her time traveling around California and around the world finding rare elusive bee species and photographing them. And so one of our species that Crystal has rediscovered is shown on the right. This is an andrenid. It's long lost from California. That means it actually, we haven't detected it sort of formally here in California in 50 or more years, and is only known from a few records. but Crystal's seen it and photographed it. And why I like this story is that it illustrates again that many of our species that are lost, they can be refound. And if we can rediscover them, then we can start to take conservation action to protect them if they need it. And so this is a framework I'm very excited about using this to explore issues around extinction risk, survey effort, detection probability, etc. And I think it will it's a good framework for getting people excited about rediscovering species. I want to mention too that Crystal has a new book out. So this has just come out. It's the ABCs of California's Native Bees, and it's a collection of photographs and stories about her travels around California photographing our native bees, and it's an amazing book. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about a project to advance important bee areas across the US. So this project is inspired by the Priority Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Areas Project, or PARCAs. These are places across the United States that have been identified as especially important for supporting amphibian and reptile populations. And these areas and this entire concept is stewarded by ARC, the Amphibian and Reptile Conservancy. So we are working with JJ Apodaca, who co-designed this project and is helping to steward these areas. We want to find areas across the US that are particularly important for imperiled bee species. So this project is being led by Oscar Martinez Lopez, postdoc in my lab. I want to say a special thank you to Ryan Drum from Fish and Wildlife and to Casey Burns from BLM. They've been real champions of this idea. And are helping to support it. So this effort's very nascent, but I want to mention it anyway because I think it has a lot of promise for identifying places around the U.S. that we can highlight and target for conservation action. So our goal in this project is to build a geospatial prioritization framework for wild bee conservation. So we want to help people find the places that are most important for supporting wild bee conservation. And then part of the workflow for this project will be to work with states to identify these areas. So I've already talked about some projects like the State of the Bees, for example, where we're going to be evaluating extinction risk and identifying our most imperiled species here in the U.S. We can use that information and work with states who are already managing certain habitats within their states. We can synthesize that information to identify these areas. Once the areas are identified, we'll be developing management plans for supporting bee populations within these important bee areas. And then a goal is to work towards formal designation of these important bee areas. And so I'm thrilled about this project because it's a place-based effort. It's an idea to highlight a project to highlight some of the places that are most important for bee conservation across the US. And it's great to be able to work with leaders in vertebrate conservation efforts and to try to adopt their frameworks and adapt them for wild bee conservation. So I realize I've covered a lot of topics. I have two QR codes over on the bottom right. One is for the National Native Bee Monitoring Research Coordination Network website. On the website, you can learn more about our work. We also have a link to a YouTube channel where we have, I think it's more than 80 presentations about topics, all kinds of topics around bee monitoring. And so you can learn more about our network by going to that link. I've also included my lab's a link to my lab's website, so you can learn more about my research program. And if you have more questions or any questions about anything that I talked about today, you can find my email on my lab website. And please feel welcome to reach out, and I'm happy to share more links or information about anything I talked about today. I want to thank all of these wonderful people listed over on the left. So you can see I ended with and many more. When you work with hundreds of people to try to advance wild bee monitoring and conservation, there are too many people to even physically fit on a slide. So I want to thank everyone that's listed here, and there are so many additional people that I've worked with. I think we have an amazing community of people working to try to protect wild bees here in the US and beyond. And all the work I've talked about today couldn't have been done without their work, and they've been a pleasure to work with. So I want to thank NAPPC too for the invitation to speak and for giving space to talk about wild bee conservation. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.